Hey guys, what's up? Pastor Josh here, and I'm coming at you with another Second Helpings. If this is your first time checking one of these out. Second Helpings is basically the idea that whatever I couldn't cram on the plate in the first part of the message, you get to come back, check this little video out, and get a little bit more of what kind of goes along with the story. So this weekend, we were talking about the idea of the burden that Nehemiah had for his city, Jerusalem, and the wall that was torn down around it. And I referenced the fact that the book of Nehemiah comes after the book of Ezra. The story of Ezra Ezra's life ends, and the book of Ezra ends about 15 years before the book of Nehemiah is written. Now, if you look at the history of the Persian Empire, you have them coming in and taking over the Babylonians. This all happens in the book of Daniel. And if you remember that Daniel, he was taken captive, and he gets thrown into a lion's den because he won't not pray to God. That's also the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they won't bow down to the Babylonian king, and so they get thrown into a fiery furnace. Great stories. Go check those out in the first half of Daniel. Daniel also, though, prophesies about a great Persian king. And most scholars believe that the prophecy of the Persian king is Cyrus the Great. That's the first king of the Persian Empire. That's the one that conquers the Babylonians. Cyrus is also the Persian king that allows the Jews to start going back to Israel. Now, when he releases the Jews from captivity, they believe that there's probably about 3 million Jews in the Babylonian, or this now Persian Empire, that are captives there. Out of the 3 million Jews that are released, roughly they think about 50,000 go back to Jerusalem and Judea and that area, the Promised Land. The math there works out to be somewhere around 2% of the Jewish people go home. So not very many of them took them up on it. Here's what I found interesting about that for the second helping. And I know some of you aren't into the history of it, but just stop and think for a second. God's people are taken out of their promised land and taken into captivity. And when given a chance to go back to the promised land, they choose to remain captives, serving the Persians rather than go back to the land that God had called them. If you read the book of Exodus, God sets the Israelites free. And instead of being thrilled that they're no longer slaves to Egypt, they spend most of their journey under Moses complaining about how tough they have it in the desert and how they wish they could go back to being slaves in Egypt. Because they're like, yeah, we weren't free, but at least we had food to eat, That's why God sends them food, manna, and provides them waters, because all they do is complain. And I thought about this, and I think sometimes we read stories like that and we think, I would never do that. But here's what I want you to understand. God set the Israelites free the same way that he promises to set us free from sin. He takes us out of bondage. And when given an opportunity to step into God's best for us, to go to the promised land, I think it's probably about 2% of us that actually pursue God's best. How many times do you and I actively stay in captivity because we're too afraid of how hard the job is going to be to go into what God promised us, to what God has that he says is better for us? So only 2% go back. That's the story. That's the book of Nehemiah. That's what Nehemiah does. He brings a group back and they begin to rebuild the temple. And it's a long problem. It's a long process because Ezra's portion of building the temple, he says it only takes him about 3 years. But if you read John chapter 2, when Jesus is in Jerusalem, he's at the temple and he says, tear the temple down and in 3 days I'll build it back up. He was talking about his physical body, that he would die on the cross, be put in the grave, and 3 days later he would rise from the dead, which is, of course, the center of our faith. But when Jesus says that, they're standing at the temple in Jerusalem and they look at him and they go, you're going to build the temple in 3 days? It took 46 years to build the temple. So Ezra says it took him 3 years, and then later in the book of John, the Pharisees say it took 46 years. Why is that? Well, at the beginning of Ezra, at the beginning of the book of Ezra, they lay the foundation for the temple. And when they lay the foundation for the temple, they have a big party for getting it started. But then they get stopped for a long time. The enemies of the temple, the enemies of the Israelites, stop them from doing it. In the weeks to come, we're going to talk a lot about the enemies that come at us to stop us from what it is that God has for us. So look for those. In the story of Nehemiah, it's mostly a guy named Sanballat and a guy named Tobiah. They're the bad guys, but we'll get to them later. In the story of Ezra, it's a bunch of different Canaanites that come after him. And so it takes the process for them to build the temple. It takes them a long time. So they get the foundation built, but even a lot of experts believe once Ezra gets the temple built, it's still not lavish. They still don't have big windows and extra rooms or anything cool because there's no wall around Jerusalem. It would just get robbed and pilfered and broken down again. So they build a temple, but they don't build it very big. Here's the portion I want you to hear from Ezra. Ezra chapter 3 says this in verse 10. When the builders completed the foundation of the Lord's temple, the priests, this is just when they get the foundation done, the priests put on their robes and they took their places to blow their trumpets. And the Levites, that's the tribe of Israel that the priests came out of. The Levites, the descendants of Asaph, clashed their cymbals to praise the Lord, just as King David had prescribed. And with praise and thanks, they sang this song to the Lord. He is good. His faithful love for Israel endures forever. Then all the people gave a great shout, praising the Lord because the foundations of the Lord's temple had been laid. Very cool. Couple verses 10 and 11. They're out of captivity. They're building the temple. Everybody's excited. Verse 12 says this though. But many of the older priests, the Levites, other leaders who had seen the first temple, wept out loud when they saw the temple's new foundation. Stop there for a second. It had been 70 years since the Babylonians burned Jerusalem down and tore down the temple. So these older guys remember when they were little boys, they remember the beautiful big temple that King Solomon had built. So now, 70 years later, when they get the foundation for the temple done, they throw this big party and all the old guys start crying because of how sad they are that it's nowhere near as big and as glamorous as the old temple. That's important, but watch what else it says in verse 12. So they're crying. The others, however, were shouting for joy. And the last verse says, the joyful shouting and the weeping mingled together in a loud noise that could be heard far in the distance. So the young people who had never seen anything better, they're excited. They're screaming with joy. The older people who remember how good it used to be, they're crying because it's nowhere near as good. Now that should hit home for us. In conclusion for this second helpings, a lot of times we'll be in the middle of God doing something great. And those of us that remember how it used to be, we spend more time complaining that it's not what it used to be. That sounds to me a lot like people talking about pre-COVID. Listen, I get it. Pre-COVID, it was a lot better and things were great. And the church did this and your family did that. And you had all these freedoms and all this stuff. And all we do is remember what it used to be like. And what we end up doing is we end up becoming people that just sit around and cry and complain that it's not as good as it used to be. Meanwhile, there's other people around us, the next generation, they don't know any better. They're just excited to see what's happening now. God is doing something right now. And those of us that consider ourselves mature, we need to be excited about whatever it is that God's doing next instead of whining about how it's not what it used to be. Because that was the problem with Ezra. And that's why when we get to Nehemiah, 15 years later, after the temple's completed, there's still no wall built because they're just a bunch of people complaining that it's not ever what it used to be. It may never be what it used to be. Put that down, write that down. It may never be what it used to be, but God's got something better coming next. We need to be the kind of people that live in the moment of God, what are you doing right now? And what do you want for whatever's coming next? Let's be that. And God may use us to encourage the next generation to be excited about following him instead of being stuck around a bunch of people that whine about what yesterday used to be like. I mean that with all the love I can. I hope that's encouraging to you. I hope you'll come see more of the Nehemiah series, and I hope I'll see you guys later. God bless you. I love you. Have a great one.